part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Today we're back with the first of two special romance-themed episodes. Because Valentine's Day is in February, we thought we should go ahead and highlight two different love stories.
The first of these that we'll be talking about is Shakespeare in Love, which is a very interesting film to talk about from a historical perspective. I wanted to get through that with a straight face, and I couldn't. The movie came out in 1998. It's one of those great 90s historical dramas. And it's sort of like, it's a period drama, but it's also a rom-com in a way. Directed by John Madden, written by Mark Norman and Tom Stoppard, the famous playwright. And it did very well at the Oscars. It won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Original Screenplay. And it was a bit controversial. It's still a controversial movie because of the fact that it beat Saving Private Ryan for Best Picture, and because of the fact that it's one of those examples of Weinstein campaigning very hard, maybe under the table, for a film to win.
Yeah.
The movie stars Gwyneth Paltrow, Joseph Fiennes. Is that? I always,
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, I say Ray Fiennes' name that way, and then I go to say his like a different way. Jeffrey Rush, Colin Firth, Ben Affleck, Jim Carter, Rupert Everett, Imelda Staunton, Judi Dench. Everyone is in this movie. It is about... What is this movie about? It's about William Shakespeare having an affair with a noblewoman and writing Romeo and Juliet, question mark. It got very positive.
A choice.
Choices were made. It got very positive reviews when it came out, and it actually grossed $289.3 million at the box office.
Insanity.
Which, it's a very popular film. The people who are not like film bros, who are just hurt that it beat Saving Private Ryan, I think people other than them love this movie. It's a very fun film, but it also makes about 1,000 bizarre choices.
It makes a lot of bizarre choices. And, I think what's so great about it is that it does have that classic, this is a 90s period drama film. We don't care about historical accuracy. We're just here for the vibes. And I'm kind of obsessed with that. I've seen this movie like a ton of times over the years. I don't know if anyone listening to this remembers like the peak years of YouTube circa like 2008 to 2011 when everybody used this film for like weird historical mashup romance like music videos on there, but I definitely used it for mine. Definitely had like a flashback of remembering that I was part of a History Girls collab group. So apparently there was a History Girls before there was a History Girls.
Oh, I love that.
Talking about period dramas, like weird memory came back to me while watching this film. But like I unabashedly love Joseph Fiennes. Like he is arguably my favorite Fiennes brother.
Ooh.
But yes, I just think he's pretty.
I was about to say, like, because you think he's more talented or because you think he's prettier?
He's prettier.
I respect that. I respect it 110%.
It really kills me to watch him in Handmaid's Tale because he's so pretty, but he is very bad on that show. But this like entire cast is just tremendous. I did spend a good portion of the time rewatching this wondering if Gwyneth Paltrow even remembers that she is in this film, because she has that whole bit about never remembering that she's in Marvel movies. So just a lot of questions there. But I know you're gonna have some opinions on this, but I loved seeing baby Ben Affleck. He is such a fetus.
He is
such a child. Also, Colin Firth was clearly having like the time of his life.
It is the most anti-Colin Firth role I've ever seen Colin Firth in.
I loved him so much. Also, I loved seeing Simon Callow as Tilney
Yes.
because we just did Phantom of the Opera, and he was also in the Dickens film, and so I kind of love that, like, we have this new theme of just Simon Callow popping up in movies.
I mean, he pops up in so many movies. Like,
his IMDb is ridiculous.
it's incredible. Yeah, I think this is one of those movies that I'm like, this is a fantastic movie and not a very good period drama. If you know what I mean. Like, it's really fun. I love it, but I also, like, scream while I'm watching it. Every time they say Virginia, just know that I yell. I
love that for me.
love that for me. I'm going to talk about that more later. I love the fact, though, that this movie, for all that it literally said, we don't care about history, or maybe, like, we don't care to bother to look up anything ever, I do love that it, like, the way that it mirrors parts of Romeo and Juliet, the way that it includes, like, tons of elements of Shakespeare's shows from, like, these very tropey characters. Like, Imelda Staunton as the nurse in it is essentially playing the same role as the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. The fact that you have a woman cross-dressing, which is, like, a very popular Shakespeare trope. Like, there's so much in it that shows such a love for Shakespeare's work, which I think is really fun. I love Rupert Everett as Christopher Marlowe. I love Rupert Everett, like, just in general. Anytime he shows up in a movie, I get really excited. So I love that he has, like, a tiny little role in this. I think, okay, Gwyneth Paltrow is a ridiculous woman. Like, nobody's arguing that she's not here, I don't think. But this is one of those movies where I'm like, damn, but she's a good actress.
She is a good actress.
Like, she may not know that she's in this film, but she is radiant in it. Like, she's fantastic. As much as I dislike Goop.
Please don't stick things.
Okay, I also have to say, you know, there were all those rumors back in the day that, like, this movie is the thing that broke up her and Winona Ryder's friendship. Which,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, the story goes that Winona Ryder had the script to audition for it, and Gwyneth, like, found it and got herself an audition.
Also, not to, like, bog down our discussion with, like, the uncomfortable fact that this was produced by Harvey Weinstein, but I seem to recall that there was also some story related to Gwyneth Paltrow and how Harvey treated her during this.
Oh, yeah.
And I tried to track it down, but I couldn't find, like, concrete. So, like, that's definitely, like, an unfortunate added layer to reflecting on this film.
Definitely. Yeah, which is, it's, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's one of those things where, like, I wouldn't want to, I mean, obviously Weinstein touched so many movies that you can't just, like, ignore them, but also it's one of those things where I'm like, I wouldn't want to not talk about this because then Gwyneth went through that for nothing in a way, you know, since the movie's already in existence. I would not support if he, you know, were able to make any new projects, I would not be supporting those. But as you mentioned before, Ben Affleck is in this movie. First of all, to me, it feels like a shame to have him in this movie and not be playing Colin Firth's role. Because I think he would have been so fun in that role. But also, keep Ben Affleck out of my period dramas 2K21.
Put him in more. Put him in more.
The thing is, I am perfectly happy for Ben Affleck to be in a period drama that is like 1930s or later. Like, that I'm totally good with. But that man has such a modern face. He's one of the people. I look at him and I know he's used to microwave. Like, I just know it intrinsically in a way that, like, I can look at Colin Firth and believe that he does not know what Wi-Fi is. But I don't mind Ben Affleck that much in this movie. Also, there are bits where they talk about the plague. It's different. It's real different. They're like, theaters should be closed. And I'm like, don't talk about theaters closing to me right now. But yeah, I love the theater recreations in this. Like, whenever I lived in London, I spent a lot of time at the Globe Theater, like a lot of time. And I love that style of theater. And so it was very fun to see that in this movie. I actually think, like, the production design of the film's pretty good and very fun. But this movie is about as historically inaccurate as something can be, but it's so fun. So because this movie it offers a lot to talk about in terms of historical accuracy, I decided to do for one of my topics today, just a general rundown of some things that I think are interesting, things in the movie that are correct and things that are incorrect. The movie is set in 1593, which is convenient because this is a period of time in Shakespeare's life that we know very little about. I think they call it like the lost years. But essentially it's these years where people, they're not really sure what Shakespeare was doing in this time. So it's convenient to set a film in that time period. They are, they do get some things right. Like the Curtain Theater was where Romeo and Juliet was performed. And the Rose Theater was in fact built by Philip Henslowe in 1587. And Shakespeare's plays were performed there. So like, you got that right. Maggie, you, I feel like, have a story about the Rose Theater.
Yes. So I have a replica posy ring that was found at the Rose Theater that I got at the Globe the first time that I visited. And I picked it because, one, I used to wear rings all the time. I don't really have a reason to wear rings now, but the initials on the inside of it had ML, and it had inscribed, "Think of me, God willing," in Latin, which I intentionally got because I had seen Phantom of the Opera that day, and it made me think of "Think of Me Fondly."
Oh my
God. It was like absolutely perfect. So anytime the Rose Theater comes up, I always think of that ring. I literally wore it every day for 5 years.
Oh, I love that.
And I love posy rings. If you are curious what posy rings are, look them up. A lot of the museums over in England have replicas of the ones that they have in their collections. And of course, as always, support museums. And if you find a ring that you fall in love with, order one for yourself.
That's so fun. I love that. So obviously the Globe is the theater that people associate with Shakespeare because it's the one that we have like a replica of now. Thanks to Sam Wanamaker. But his plays were also performed at the Rose Theater and the Curtain Theater, as we see in the movie, and also at a theater that is just called The Theater, which I find really delightful. I think the biggest historical inaccuracy in this movie, other than the one that bothers me the most, but the biggest one, obviously, is that Shakespeare did not come up with the idea for Romeo and Juliet. He took it from an Italian story called The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet, which was translated by Arthur Brooke into English in 1562. Like, the thing about Shakespeare is that I'm fairly certain that man never had an original thought in his life. And that's, like, I'm not saying that as a criticism of him. I am someone who tends to be fonder of adaptations. So, that's not me trying to throw shade at him, but basically everything that he did is either based on history or based on some other existing story or play or whatever. I mean, obviously there are ones that we don't have a clear track to something else, but Romeo and Juliet is very clearly based on this Italian story. So that's kind of the biggest inaccuracy, I would say, is just this whole idea of him coming up with this story is false. Obviously, that's before we get into the fact that, he probably never had an affair with a noblewoman, who was posing as an actor in a theater. But that's the sort of historical inaccuracy that I can very easily forgive. If you want to tell me, Shakespeare fell in love with whoever you want to, you can. In the beginning of the film, we see him signing his name over and over, and a lot of them are fairly illegible. I was kind of would he really be wasting that much paper? But that's how I was all right, come on, Nicole, get your head in the game. But this is a
Gotcha, get your head.
I'm still sticking that Zac Efron. I'm stuck in our 2 podcasts ago. But this is a reference to the fact that several versions of his signature exist, and some of them have different spellings of his name. But that apparently is a direct reference to that, which I find fun. There's a lot of things in the movie that are very direct references to things that we do know about Shakespeare, which I think is really cool. We also see this teenage or child John Webster, who would go on to be Jacobean playwright and write works like The White Devil, and the one that I feel like most people probably know is The Duchess of Malfi. His plays were known for being really bloody and really gory, which is why it's really funny whenever he says that his favorite is Titus Andronicus. And he's all he keeps saying that he likes the violent parts of these plays. I think that's a really fun addition. This is one of my favorite things. The House of Wessex, which is what Colin's first character is supposed to be from, had actually, that title had died out in like 1125. So that wouldn't have existed in this time period. It wasn't revived until the current Prince Edward was given that title upon his marriage. It has never been confirmed, but that did occur after this film came out. And so some people, including the British tabloids, speculated that he asked for that title to be revived after seeing the movie. Which is incredible if true. Honestly, it's incredible if it's not true. But like the fact that the British tabloids had a field day with it. I love that. Another thing that's a funny inaccuracy is that there is actually like a 6-year period in between Shakespeare writing Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare writing Twelfth Night, as he supposedly starts to do at the end of the movie. So like not quite. The thing that drives me nuts, the thing that I yell about continually, the thing that I made my Letterboxd review about, is the fact that Wessex, Colin Firth's character, supposedly has a tobacco plantation in Virginia, and at the end of the film, he and Gwyneth Paltrow go to Virginia. The movie takes place in 1593. The Virginia colony was founded in 1607. Can you hear the pain in my voice?
Can you just like, I am a Virginianer.
Yeah.
I'm a Virginian. My family has been here for so long, and I'm like, but not that long.
Like, I grew up going to Jamestown fairly regularly. Like, that was kind of like,
same.
That was what we would do for vacations. We would either go to Disney World or we would go to Williamsburg and Jamestown. So I could have told you that Virginia was founded in 1607 since the time I was like 7 years old. Like, that's one of those weird numbers that is burned into my brain. And so, like, as soon as he said Virginia, I was like, Virginia didn't exist then. Yeah, it just drives me. And, like, tobacco didn't really become a big thing until James I's reign. Yeah, so that drives me a little bit insane. So, you know, to any of my friends who might be watching this, I will watch this movie. I do enjoy this movie, but know that if you ever ask to watch it with me, I will yell about the Virginia thing the entire way through. Obviously, another one of those like liberties that the film takes is that Queen Elizabeth I certainly never went to a public theater. Luckily, like, I can forgive this one because the film kind of acknowledges it even within the film that like that definitely didn't happen. It makes for a good scene, though. Love that Judi Dench won Best Supporting Actress, even though she has like 8 minutes of screen time. That's really fun. Playhouses also were closed from January of 1593 to the spring of 1594 because of the plague and because of social unrest in London. So, like, there are multiple reasons that this story could not take place in the year that it's set, even excluding the fact that Virginia didn't exist. But yeah, I found that to be kind of funny. Like it's almost like they went out of their way to find a time when it couldn't have happened. And also, one of the things that like I think is very obviously the movie kind of playing with us is auditions, like we see in this movie. You know, there's that audition scene, which is really fun. But that wasn't a thing at the time because you would have a play troupe or company that would perform in repertoire. And so typically, like, young boys would be apprenticed to learn the trade of acting because it was kind of considered a trade then. And then they would grow into the older roles. And players did move from company to company, but you wouldn't audition to play a specific role. They would take someone on for their ability to play, you know, a variety of roles. So you certainly wouldn't have had something like what we see in the movie. So that's my rant on sort of the general historical accuracy of this movie. Obviously, it's very inaccurate in many ways. But I do think that some of the things that they do include, like, you know, having this character of John Webster, the stuff with, like, Shakespeare's signature, are really fun historical details. So, obviously, they did some research. I would love to discuss with them the decision to make Virginia a somewhat major plot point in this movie.
It's mentioned so many times.
Like, you could play a drinking game and just drink every time they mention Virginia, and you could probably get drunk. Like, and it's one of those things where it's like, you didn't need to make that choice for the story to work, so why did you? Like, did you not know, or did you just not care? I can't decide. There are many other places this man could have made his money. Yeah, it's.
I feel like this was just the 1990s being like, we're just making a pretty film. Do not look for historical accuracy.
Which just drives me a little crazy. Like I said, I don't care about inaccuracy in terms of like Shakespeare definitely never had this affair. That's fine. I can forgive the whole Queen Elizabeth coming to the theater thing. But to pretend that a colony exists when it doesn't, like, that's the kind of thing that grinds my gears a bit. Like, that's the kind of thing that I can't really forgive in a movie. I just want to know. I want to know what their thought process was.
Me too. Maybe one day we'll get to interview somebody involved and ask what were they thinking.
If any of them are listening, please, like, I just want to know. Like, slide into my DMs on Twitter and
seriously,
tell me.
just hit us up.
Yeah,
hit us up. We're curious. Inquiring minds would like to know.
So I think one of the inaccurate things that we see in the movie, but it's treated within the world, which I think is fine. It's one of the things that I'm willing to accept, is that we see a woman on stage.
Yes. So I had a really hard time figuring out how I was going to approach this topic. I did do a presentation in community college in like 2009 about this. So I sadly do not have any of my notes in that, but I still remember researching about a very specific female actor of the time. So I wanted to highlight her because I felt like it was a good avenue to do that. So just to kind of set the scene, after the First English Civil War, the Puritan Long Parliament forced the closure of all London theaters. Unsurprisingly, it didn't fully stick because playwrights and actors are the rogues that your mom has warned you about. But it was repeatedly reinforced and also heavily enforced for those that tried to break this law. Essentially, London theaters were dead for 12 years until the downfall of Cromwell and his puritanical ideology. So, like, it was quiet for a while in the streets of London. At the same time, when Cromwell fell, women were finally allowed on stage. Now, this is under the ruling of King Charles II, who in 1660 lifted the ban on theaters. At that time, of course, men were still playing these female roles, and unsurprisingly, the king took issue with this. Do you have any idea why he might have taken an issue with men playing female roles? Could it have been unnatural vices, which is a code word for something else entirely?
Unnatural vices, one of my favorite code words.
Yes. So in 1662, during this restoration period, King Charles II decided to lift the ban and declared that only women should portray women on stage. I'm not entirely sure which play that he saw that he was like, nope, that should not be happening on stage. But at the same time, Thomas Killigrew and William Davenant, I'm very sorry to their ghost if I mispronounce their names. But they went into immediate action following this ban being lifted. They received the first patents to build theaters in London. Killigrew built the King's Company and Davenant built Duke's Company. And they were also very quick to start casting women in roles in their plays. So in enters Margaret Hughes, who played Desdemona in Thomas Killigrew's production of Othello, which was put on December 8th, 1660. So, like, right after the ban was lifted, he was starting to put women in his plays, even though that this official decree that all women had to be played by women hadn't come into effect yet. So he was, like, very quick to be like, nope, I want to cast women in this. She's often referred to as the first recorded woman on stage in England. However, there are often discrepancies about this claim. It seems to be a very hot button debate subject for theatrical historians.
Well, obviously, that's because the first one was Gwyneth Paltrow in a Shakespeare play.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. We also know that Killigrew staged an all-female cast production of his play, The Parson's Wedding, in 1664, and he did it again about 10 years later. I've always been enraptured with Margaret, or Peg as she is known. Maybe it's because we share a name. But she was written about by many noted authors at the time, including Pepys. Pepys described her as a mighty pretty woman and seems, but is not modest, which I thought was quite humorous. She was also noted to have had very lovely legs.
Oh, very, very lovely legs. Wow.
Which I did not put into my notes, but I just remembered that because I'm wondering if it was because for so long these men were very repressed and they weren't seeing ankles.
Oh my, and then they were like, wow.
Wow. Yes, London theatre was very scandalous. You might see a woman's ankle. But Margaret later became the mistress of Prince Rupert, and they had a daughter named Ruperta or Ruperta. I don't know how to say Rupert with an A on the end.
That's incredible.
But they seem to be genuinely in love. He even gifted her with his mother, Elizabeth of Bohemia's prized pearl drop earrings, which I can't help but wonder was a play on the fact that our name means pearl.
I love that.
So I would like to think that was a play on that. They never married, but he did claim their daughter as his. And she still performed after they got together. She was back on stage 3 years after their daughter was born. So she's still very active and very prolific in her performance. Unfortunately, Rupert died in 1682, leaving Margaret and her daughter with plenty of money and a home in Hammersmith, but Margaret really enjoyed gambling and she gambled away pretty much all of her money, and she ended up relying on her daughter for the rest of her life, and she did live to be 89 years old, which I think is pretty astounding. If you look her up, there is a lovely portrait of her that graces most of the blog posts, articles, and books, and it is one where she is showing off her favorite breast.
Her favorite one.
Her favorite one, which this is a small tangent, but the whole favorite breast thing is this weird myth that has kind of like permeated art history, because there is this this trend starting in around the late 1400s into the 1700s, I believe, of women, notable women, including queens, having these portraits done with one of their breasts revealed. And so somewhere along the way, this idea came to be that they were showing off their favorite breast. Apparently this is not true, but it has even been noted in well-respected historical books. No idea where this originally came from. Allegedly, it came from a Twitter thread.
Oh my God.
It makes for a great story, but I did find that allegedly it was meant to indicate that a woman was like fertile. Because breasts were a symbol of like breastfeeding, but then there's also this idea that rich women would often hire milk, I was going to say milkmaids, which is not the right thing, wet nurses, to breastfeed their children. And so they would show off their breast in portraits because they had not been damaged from breastfeeding. Sorry for this small tangent, but you're getting an art history lesson today, as well as Shakespeare and love history.
Wow, okay.
Hopefully you learned something today.
Yeah, no, that was very fun. Okay. Incredible.
The more you know.
Well, continuing on our theme of Saoirse Ronan voice, women. I wanted to talk a bit about Anne Hathaway, because I think that it's kind of, I could talk a lot about the fact that often in these movies that have to do with historical periods like this, sometimes I feel like people would rather make up a female character than use an existing female character, but that's a story for another day. But, you know, the movie has some like vague references to Shakespeare's wife, but doesn't really delve into the fact that he was, in fact, very married. And there's been a lot of misinformation about Anne Hathaway over the years, so I wanted to talk about her a bit. So she is also sometimes referred to as Agnes. It's not really clear which one she actually went by, but she was actually 8 years older than William Shakespeare. She came from a family of tenants of this cottage on a 90-acre farm in Shottery, which is right next to Stratford-upon-Avon. It's now a museum owned by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. I've been to it. It's a very nice cottage. Anne was the oldest of 8 siblings, and her father was a farmer, and after his death in 1581, her brother took over the cottage and the farm, and she continued living with her siblings, and I believe it was her stepmother at the time. So when she marries Shakespeare in 1582, she's 26 years old, and he's 18. So he's actually quite young to be getting married in this period. She was in fact 3 months pregnant at the time of their wedding. And a lot of people have taken this to mean that it was sort of a shotgun wedding, that he was forced into marrying her, but that's not necessarily true. It actually wasn't uncommon at the time for a woman to already be pregnant at the time that the couple had their church wedding. And that's partially because a lot of legal weddings were preceded by a hand fasting ceremony, sometimes several months in advance, and often couples would consummate their marriage after the hand fasting ceremony. There's also a lot of misconceptions that the couples weren't having premarital sex in this time period that aren't necessarily true, and that's partially because a lot of what we think of in terms of attitudes towards sex and marriage and relationships come from the Victorian period, which was a lot more purity obsessed than most of history before it. But regardless of what the circumstances were, she was pregnant at the time that they were married. Shakespeare did apply to the bishop's court in Worcester. I can never say these English names.
It's it's Worcester, or Worcester.
Yeah, right. Something.
And it depends on if you're in like Boston or if you're in England.
Right? I'm like, I don't know how to say it. Some British person yell at me in my mentions and tell me how to say it. But he did apply to move up the wedding, which I think is interesting. She moved in with him and his parents in their very nice 2-story house that was sort of in the center of Stratford-upon-Avon after their marriage. And Anne and William had 3 children, Susanna, who was born 6 months after their wedding, and then the twins, Judith and Hamnet, who were born in 1585, so 3 years after the wedding. Hamnet actually died at the age of 11 during an outbreak of the plague, and there actually was a book published last year that has to do with that. I have not read it yet, but it's called Hamnet. It's a historical fiction sort of telling about the Shakespeare family. If anyone listening has read it and has thoughts, please do let me know, because I'm trying to decide if I should buy a copy. Not long after their wedding, Will Shakespeare headed to London to pursue an acting and writing career. And there's this sort of myth that then he doesn't return to see her for years, and that's not true. We do know that he definitely was visiting Stratford-upon-Avon frequently, although it is believed that there's no proof that Anne ever went to London. It seems that he always came home to Stratford-upon-Avon. And if you know anything about English geography, if you've been to London and been out to Stratford-upon-Avon, you know that it's a bit of a journey in that time, but it's not an insurmountable distance by any means. Even with without trains and cars. In 1596, Will Shakespeare purchased a large home called New Place in Stratford-upon-Avon for Anne and the children to move into, and he himself moved back to Stratford-upon-Avon in 1610 when he sort of retired from his theater work, and Will and Anne lived out the rest of his life until he died in 1616. There's a very interesting movie that came out a couple of years ago, directed by Kenneth Branagh, starring Kenneth Branagh and Judi Dench, called All Is True, about this time in Shakespeare's life. In his will, he leaves her the second best bed. And this has thought by a lot of people to be some sort of insult to her. But actually, some scholars believe that it's because their second best bed would have likely been the bed that they slept in. Their best bed would have likely been their bed for guests to use. So in that case, it would be that he's leaving her, their marital bed, not that he's saying you can have the second nicest one. And I also think it's important to note that everything else was left to their daughter, which is why, it's interesting that like people try to be like, oh, that's all he left her. And it's like, well, she would have continued living with her daughter and her daughter's husband, but he specifically wanted to call out to leave that to her. She dies in 1623 at the age of 67. And they're buried together in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, which you can go and see today.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think she's a really interesting figure, and obviously we don't know that much about her, like we don't know that much about him. But I think that there's scholars in earlier time periods definitely tried to cast their relationship in a really bad light. But whenever you actually kind of examine the facts, it doesn't seem as bad as some earlier historians wanted to make it out to be.
So I felt like we needed to talk about costumes now.
Always.
Since there are so many fabulous costumes in this film. So the costumes were designed by Sandy Powell.
One of the greats.
She has been working in costume design since 1984. Most notably, she has designed costumes for Interview with the Vampire Chronicles, my favorite film, Gangs of New York, The Other Boleyn, Young Victoria, The Favourite, and The Irishman, to name just a few. Oh, and she also costumed The Departed with Matt Damon.
No! I can't have to talk about Ben Affleck and Matt Damon in one podcast. Don't do this to me.
I'm sorry. Well, you did mention Saving Private Ryan earlier, so.
Yeah, I like to forget that he's in that.
You opened yourself up for this. But she actually won an Oscar for Best Costume Design for Shakespeare in Love. Like you said earlier, Shakespeare in Love snatched up all the Oscars. I did find a quote from the film's press packet from Sandy talking about the costumes. She said, "My aim was not to create absolutely historically accurate costumes, but to use a bit of artistic license, and as the script is so fresh and light, I felt there was room for the imagination while always keeping it convincing," which I think she accomplished. The costumes feel very accurate for what they're putting on. There are definitely some pieces that didn't entirely work, but overall, I felt like she pulled off what the script was kind of putting on the table. I also found in another article where she said that the first costumes she worked with are the costumes where Viola is dressing up as a man. She was worried that they wouldn't be convincing enough. So that was where she kind of set her focus on first and then filled in around there. One of the problems with this film's costumes, in my opinion, is that they span over 50 years of Elizabethan fashion over a brief period of about 2 to 3 months, which I thought was definitely a choice. But to me, that feels like potentially the director had like a very idealized version of Elizabethan fashion and just said, that's what I want, and we're running with it. So I'm not going to hold that against her. The rest of her body of work says that she is very well aware of historical accuracy in the time periods. I am simply obsessed with Viola's dresses. They're absolutely gorgeous, particularly all of the collars that are featured on most of her dresses and her costumes just really accentuate Gwyneth's natural features, and it just worked perfectly for her. I loved the Queen's peacock dress. It's simply gorgeous. However, the standing collar with the neck ruff don't really fit together, and I noticed that happen a few times. Not only the main characters, but some of the background, which again, I think is probably a side effect of this idealized idea of what Elizabethan fashion looked like. I also think that the reason why Virginia is mentioned so much is because somebody went to Jamestown and they saw the pictures and they're like, hey, they're wearing the same ruffs that Shakespeare wore. And so they thought, it's the same. They're looking at 2 pictures and they're like, this is the same time period. And I think that's just kind of a great example of what this film does wrong is that it paints an entire period of history which has very complex nuances, not only in what's happening globally, but what's happening with fashion. And they just kind of merge it all together and hope nobody notices. And we noticed. We definitely noticed.
Yeah.
But that's yeah, that's a thing.
It's, you know, it's one of those movies where obviously they aren't totally historically accurate costumes, but they are so fun. And I think they fit the tone of the movie so well that, you know, I'm not going to take issue, other than, like you said, that one dress where, like, the standing collar and the neck ruff just...
It clashes.
Yeah. Choices were made. Choices were
definitely made. I will say I did find a few blogs that talked about the fact that some of the Queen's dresses looked like they had definitely been pulled from actual portraits of the Queen, which was nice to see. But again, the Queen later in life would not have been wearing some of the dresses that they put her in. Some of those dresses were from her younger years in a slightly different era of costuming, but you know, it's a really pretty movie.
And I don't think she would have been re-wearing her younger dresses. But you know what? That's fine.
No.
It's fine.
This is fine.
A lot of this movie is me just like holding things and being like, this is fine. But I do want to say before we finish that I feel like I've come off as very critical. I actually do very much enjoy this film. It just is so funny to me from a historical accuracy perspective to look at it and be like, I mean, I just look at it and I'm like, Virginia was founded in 1607. I have questions about some of the mistakes in it that just seem kind of lazy. But thank you guys so much for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed this 19th episode of Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think about Shakespeare in Love.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Make sure to give us a follow while you're there. You can also find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on the Earglue Media website. And, of course, over on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we will be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. Virginia didn't exist then.